Hey guys, it's me, Frankie. Thanks for joining in on my podcast, Moments of History. Today, I'm going to be talking about the controversial 1962 court case, Engel v. Vitale, which reformed the education system and caused quite a reaction. How would you feel if your child was forced to do a group prayer every morning at school when you guys don't even believe in God? This led to the notable court case, Engel v. Vitale. This legal dispute reformed the views of religious practice in public schools. The year was 1962. A New York state law required public schools to open each day with the Pledge of Allegiance and a non-denominational prayer in which the students recognized their dependence upon God. The prayer was as stated, "Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and may beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country." Now to me, that doesn't sound too crazy, but to someone who doesn't believe in God, that could be really offensive to them. The school administration required parental consent to authorize a student's absence from the classroom during the prayer. Supreme Court Justice Hugo L. Black says, "It is no part of the business of government to compose official prayers. It violates the student's First Amendment rights." But again, the students did have the option to opt out of the prayer.
It was Justice Hugo Black who wrote the majority opinion, and in it he said, "The First Amendment was added to the Constitution to stand as a guarantee that neither the power nor the prestige of the federal government would be used to control, support, or influence the kinds of prayer the American people can say."
A group of parents led by Stephen Engel challenged the practice. Engel sued the school's principal, Vitale. To them, the prayer violated the First Amendment's Establishment Clause, which says, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion." The group of people gathered by Engel consisted of parents, the ACLU, and the American Ethical Union. Engel's group first protested in front of the student school, Herrick's Union School District. He hoped that protesting would make the school district stop the coercion on the students and prevent further making people uncomfortable. They appealed this case to the New York Court of Appeals, which ruled that such state-composed prayers in public school violated the First Amendment's Establishment Clause. The 14th Amendment says, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States." So the 14th Amendment applies the First Amendment to the states as well as the federal government. The majority of courts stated that the provision allowing students to absent themselves from this activity did not make the law constitutional. The purpose of the First Amendment was to prevent government interference with religion. Since Americans adhere to a wide variety of beliefs, it is not appropriate for the government to endorse any particular belief system. The majority noted that wars, persecutions, and other destructive measures often arose in the past when the government involved itself in religious affairs. But the students weren't the only ones who were contravened, right? The teachers were forced to lead the students in their recitation of the prayer. Not every teacher is religious. That's just not fair. Justice William Douglas said, "Once the government finances a religious exercise, it inserts a divisive influence into our communities." The Supreme Court, in a 6-1 decision, found that the state's role in composing and recommending prayer was a violation of the separation of church and state.
So the state argued that since the prayer was voluntary and not promoting a specific religion, that it should be upheld. However, the Supreme Court disagreed. In a landmark ruling by a 6-1 majority, the Supreme Court ruled that states cannot hold prayer in public schools, even if that prayer is voluntary and even if it is not tied to a specific religion.
This ruling established that public schools cannot compose or promote official prayers, regardless of their neutrality or optional nature, as it forces the government into the business of religion. Engel v. Vitale is widely viewed as one of the most unpopular decisions in Supreme Court history. Rodney K. Smith wrote in a study on public prayer, "Public furor with the Engel decision was without equal in any prior Supreme Court case." Students should still be able to practice their faith shamelessly without being judged. Some of them can't afford to go to private school or their parents don't approve of it. They should be able to pray whenever they want instead of having to wait until a certain time. You might be wondering, why don't the students lead the prayer instead? Well, they could form a religious group amongst themselves, so no one else would have to say the prayer if they didn't want to. No teachers or students could be offended since they wouldn't have to say and lead the prayer. It would avoid a lot of conflict and provide a safe space for religious students. But if it was organized by the school and not the students themselves, that would still be a violation of the First Amendment. Maybe within each classroom, students could go off to a corner of the room or go outside to pray so they wouldn't be offending anyone since no one else would hear them. But if the school told religious students to pray to themselves and before classes so as not to offend anyone, that would be a violation of the First Amendment because it involves church and state. However, if the silent student-led prayer was organized by the religious students themselves, that would be free will and wouldn't be a violation. I know that sounds like a lot, but in simpler terms, if the students organize it, then that would be okay. But if the school organized it, then that would be imposing beliefs. Justice Potter Stewart was the one justice who dissented, and his reasoning was that the practice of school prayer was constitutional because it gave children the opportunity of sharing in the spiritual heritage of our nation. Engel v. Vitale is an important case because the Engel decision was a demonstration of how the court ruled in favor of individual liberties. The prayer was composed by government officials as a program to increase religious beliefs. It could have been that all students were religious or tolerant of having morning prayer due to the fact that no requests to remove students from having to say the prayer were issued. Even so, when religion is forced upon someone, it typically drives them away and causes confusion. The New York State government's interest wasn't to increase beliefs, but rather use a moral education initiative to cultivate a sense of ethics among the students, which officials believed was essential to students' development and civic values. We're promoting religion, but it reinforced Thomas Jefferson's wall of separation between government authority and religious practice, as outlined in the Constitution. It aims schools to be welcoming to students of all faiths or no faiths. However, it comes off as demanding that students participate in general religious practices. For people with bad religious experiences, that could really offend them. I mean, it's common knowledge that not everyone wants religion or is interested in hearing about it. But as stated earlier, they don't have to hear the prayer. They can leave the room with parental consent, instead of having to say the prayer with all the other students. The students can form their own group to say prayers. Here's something to think about. What if a student had religious parents? However, the students themselves didn't believe in that specific religion. Do you think they could still opt out of the prayer? The Supreme Court ruled that state-sponsored mandatory prayer in public schools was unconstitutional. The court held that if a student is permitted to stay during prayer, the government cannot endorse any religion or force any religious prayer upon them. But just because an issue was resolved doesn't mean we should forget about it. I'm glad that Vitale was brought to justice. If he really wanted prayer in his school, he should have worked at a religious private school. We need to acknowledge how hard that must have been for the students. You can't just force religious activities upon children. The Supreme Court ruled it as unconstitutional for a reason. The Supreme Court has consistently ruled against the mandatory religious activities in public schools in which violations can lead to court orders requiring schools to stop the activity. What would you do if your child was forced to pray in their public school? At that age, children are figuring out who they are and probably don't have a good idea of their religious values. Imagine how confused those children must have been. First, you get told that you are free to practice any religion because this is America. Then next thing you know, your school is promoting religion. You can't force children into religion. They should have their own opinions. Especially since they are so young, they shouldn't have to make big decisions, such as if they will practice religion. You know, this is actually really interesting, because the court of Kern County was actually discussing whether to post the 10 Commandments in public schools. This decision followed a year-long debate and concern over potential lawsuits. The initiative wanted to display the text as historical, not religious, but faced significant legal and community opposition. It's funny how a lot of school districts are trying to incorporate religion into generally agnostic environments. That actually could be a help, though. The commandments have general rules for human decency, such as being truthful, not stealing, etc. As we start wrapping this up, remember the importance of Engel v. Vitale and that you should never force religion upon anyone. Thank you for tuning in on the case Engel v. Vitale.